Hello, everybody. So I thought I'd return with another, not podcast, but what should we call it, animated PowerPoint slide. Today, I'm going to walk you through some of the basics about qualitative research methods in clinical research itself. Relatively short, 15 slides-ish, some examples, and just basically covering a few or three key areas. So the topics covered in this podcast stroke annotated PowerPoint presentation are: what is qualitative research? Types of data collection methods in qualitative research, data analysis in qualitative research, all orientated towards clinical, medical, healthcare related sectors. So firstly, what is qualitative research? I decided one of the easiest ways to explain this is setting up a dichotomy with quantitative research and demonstrating some of the pros and cons of each approach. Against a list of questions, sorry. There we go. So you can see I've decided to note down some cross sections between purpose, approach, data collection methods, research independence, sampling, and how the different methods describe reality itself between qualitative and quantitative methods. Of course, it's not extensive, but it does give you some kind of overview, aiming more for an introductory approach in this podcast. So, what's the purpose of qualitative research? Really is to provide context to other data or to expand existing theory approaches. This is really more orientated to, I'd say, a clinical approach where you're going to use qualitative methods to expand existing quantitative analyses or economic analyses, whatever it might be. Your approach really is more observational and interpretive than it is about measuring or testing a particular structure. Again, we won't coming to necessary definitive conclusions. This is not a pass-fail sort of mechanism with qualitative work. The most divergent area between the two approaches really is the data collection method. So typically in healthcare and clinical related research, you'll come across types of interviewing and types of ethnography, really. And more importantly, these approaches are structured or unstructured sometimes. So you don't really even know what you're going to be dealing with when you go into a completely unstructured interview process. Whereas if you look at quantitative approaches, they are protocol-driven, structured, and predetermined, really. So qualitative work is a lot more explorative, really, than quantitative approaches. Equally, the researcher is situated in their own research in the qualitative approach, so you are part of what you're doing, and necessarily then you should be reflective about your position within the research rather than the more traditional clinical approaches where your researcher is objective and removed from the research process itself, particularly in the laboratory situations. You can see the clear distinction of a qualitative approach because you're dealing with the human subject rather than any sub-level analysis, whether it be pathological or whatever it might be. Again, your sampling methods are going to be different. So qualitative work typically is a lot smaller in terms of its sample size. The scope can be different as well. So typically, I would say things like the extensiveness of the data that you're collecting. You might focus on a group of individuals, sometimes 3 patients you have a lot of in-depth research into rather than a multi-site, multinational trial type of environment. Equally, got a lot of qualitative work, and I've set this up deliberately to highlight the extremes of it, but a lot of qualitative approaches are really describing social constructs rather than objective biological reality, which is more appropriate for quantitative research. It's not to say that either is correct. Typically, you will be using a mixed methods approach in clinical work. They'll have to synthesize both together, but you'll be more orientated to finding social constructs and sociology associated with qualitative work. So what are the pros and cons of each? Again, continuing this dichotomy to set them up against each other, which will help you understand, hopefully, both to some extent. So qualitative research advantages, well, it's lower cost, particularly if you need to normally invest in expensive laboratory equipment, so you don't have to pay as much money. It can be done quickly if required, so if you just want to use a few focus groups from your patients, let's say you're in the UK and you've got a patient participation group associated with your primary care setting, i.e. if you're a GP or your family doctor, That can be done rapidly. You don't have to go through as many procedures necessarily. You've still got to do the ethics, but beyond that, you can hammer something out quickly at the need of what your data requires, in all honesty. So you are providing important contextual information in qualitative work. This can be of use for policy making, management decisions, and other human-centered activities. Typically, patient feedback is the most obvious one, where patients feedback into the research process. So if I was thinking about clinical trials, for example, you can integrate the patient feedback from everything from the initial scoping stages into the research formation of questions, getting their opinion about appropriate outcome measures, in addition to the patients being part of the trial themselves, and also after the trial, engaging with them down the line too. So this is a method that can be employed at any point within clinical research. It doesn't have to be just in it itself. The patients are not just the focus, but you're going to engage before and after for debriefing purposes too. What are the downsides? It is a small sample size. Qualitative work in clinical areas, typically we're not really aiming for the kind of generalizability that you get for quants approaches. If you do choose a method such as ethnography, which is deliberately longitudinal, it can be time consuming. You are looking at a minimum of about 6 months to do a decent piece of ethnographic research. It can be theoretically dense, so if you're not particularly used to applying theoretical approaches in qualitative research, you might have to do a lot of background reading. When someone says to you, I want to use a realist approach, which are quite current in a lot of clinical qualitative work, if you don't know what realism is or how to apply it or what critical realism is, it's going to take a lot of background reading, because realism is predicated on previous philosophical traditions and work. I mean, that example in particular comes out of basically the theological movements from medieval Catholicism, and you don't need to go into that much detail, but all the terminology and how it's evolved is predicated on a long philosophical history. So it might take you a little while to learn what some of the things are if you were going to meaningfully apply them. Equally, one particular disadvantage might be with qualitative work too, though, is that there are not distinct phases sometimes in how you approach it. This is not a linear approach. Your data collection may bleed into your data analysis as you're doing it, and you're meant to have an iterative, emerging approach to the work. So if you're looking for clear-cut processes that are delineated into steps, it's a bit of a different way of doing things. You can make similar arguments for quantitative approaches, but I won't go into them too much, other than more to say that quant approach, you can have more conclusive answers, they're statistically robust. This is good from a legal point of view. If you're doing anything that needs to feed into a policy decision in some way, you will want some quant data to work with the GMC, General Medical Council, governance bodies or government departments as well. Qualitative work cannot tell you if something really passes or fails a threshold, because it's not designed for that kind of level of rigor or generalizability to tell the truth to you. So if you're looking for something like that, it's not going to suit you. It is more about adding context to what you're already doing. However, it can be less time consuming and less financially resource draining upon your research budget. Okay, next slide. So, types of common data collection methods in qualitative research in a clinical environment. Methods include interviews. This is definitely the most common that you'll come across if you're completely new to how to use qualitative work. Interviews are basically, well, someone once wrote that sociology is the craft of the interview. That's the whole basis of the method for that discipline. And a lot of qualitative work flows out of sociology. Interviewing exists already in many clinical scenarios between doctor-patient interaction. There are multiple different ways to go about this, which I'll explore with you in a minute. In essence, it's you and one other person. Typically, sometimes you might have a scribe, and you're trying to elicit responses from that person from a predetermined set of questions that you've agreed that are based upon your research objectives that you want to achieve. Interviewing can be anything from half an hour, or you can spend 4 hours with a patient to have an in-depth discussion and understand the narratives about their particular disease or whatever it is that you're interested in. They don't have to be short, they can be as long as you require. Observational data. This is basically where instead of interviewing people, you will place yourself within a particular situation. Typically, it's organizationally focused. Let's say you're interested in health service delivery. You might act as, let's pick something different. You might say you work in the patient patient liaison group in a large hospital, and you can watch the interactions of doctors and patients in a particular area. It could be anesthetics, for example. Watch how people interact. Maybe you are a trained nurse and you go and do ethnographic data in the real world scenario of an operating theatre, observing all the interaction between the surgeon and the anaesthetist and the other clinical staff within that environment, how their speech works, how they communicate, the flow of information, etc. So you're not interviewing directly, you're partaking and observing in something. That can be a sort of an active engagement, like I said, where you actually say you are a nurse playing a role with an organisation, or it can be more passive, where you are sitting in, let's say you could sit in an A&E, accident and emergency service environment, and watch the interactions without being a patient yourself. Lastly, an expanded idea of interviews is just focus groups, which is you as a researcher with multiple people and you're guiding conversations between groups. So, for example, the other week I helped some clinical companies and some general practitioners come together to talk about the role that their product could take in the different general practice scenarios, and you're guiding the conversation. You give them group exercises sometimes. You ask them to write about the barriers to the implementation of particular technologies. It's fairly standard stuff, running a group, but you've got a basic metric, a basic outline of what you're going to be doing at any rate. So how would you employ these, or where would you employ them? Methodology, i.e. typically cases. Are you looking at discrete individual events that you're interested in, or would you want something more ethnographic, where you're basically situating yourself across a different a longitudinal process? So cases really, let's say I'm interested in something in general practice and I want to sample how this phenomenon, let's say it could be a new policy or a new intervention, happens in different general practice scenarios, maybe in different locations. So you're observing the same discrete intervention in different areas of different parts of your country, either regionally or nationally. Whereas an ethnographic approach would be to situate yourself in one particular area for a long period of time, rather than focusing on one particular event in different locations. So what kind of data does this generate? Audio-visual materials. You'll get a lot of audio recordings. So when you do your interviews, you'll record them on a dictaphone or a phone if appropriate. That interview data is then transcribed and turned into text, but the raw files will be the recording of the speech. Similarly, some people in ethnography use visual methods. This can be photography, or it can be an actual video camera, where you record the focus group perhaps, or however you want to set up the scenario. In this way you can record not just the verbal interactions like the sound of my voice, for example, but you can record the physical movements, the gesticulation. Perhaps you want to look at the facial movement, how people move around in a given environment. If you're in an A&E scenario, you might want to actually look at the flows of people, so you use visual data to do it. Or you take photos to recall the scenario visually. It's sort of aid memoir for your research methods. Equally though, you can take documentation if it's too obtrusive to actually record visually or audibly. Maybe on your lunch break, if you're working, let's say, as a GP in GP practice and you're functioning as the receptionist, you might use your lunch break to write down, document the things that you witnessed throughout the day or after the day. When you get a moment to do so, to scribble down your notes, and you'll keep your own private diary that no one else can see. That is basically your evidence base as a form of text. Lastly, maybe if you're doing some form of ethnographic work or even case studies, you might go through patient records or other test data or other forms of textual data. It could be clinical case reports, it could be discharge information, whatever it might be. So, of course, interviews are definitely the most common method you'll come across. It's, in brief, worth explaining how interviews work. There's basically two approaches, and I've got a fairly low fidelity diagram to show you. So, the first thing to be said is really that interviews for research require several skills to be conducted at once. Primarily, your role as the interviewer is to guide the conversation from open scoping questions in the initial phases of the interview to generating more specific information by the end. At the same time, the interviewer has to be able to explore tangential stories and anecdotes that bring richness to the data without losing the overall direction of the interview. Hence, the interviewer must be directed but not rigid in their approach to prevent the interviewer from deviating from one of the two extremes. So, for example, If you're so formulaic in your interviewing that you don't engage the interviewee and they're fairly silent, they give you yes, no answers or any mechanistic responses to what you're asking them, you may as well give them a survey, because there's no point in trying to go for the depth. That's what your interview technique is trying to elicit from the person or patient you're speaking to, is depth. So if you don't really care about depth, then maybe surveys might be better for you. Equally, you don't want to have endless amounts of tangents in your interview unless you're starting from a complete blank slate. So yes, don't let the participant go on too long. You need to kind of control the flow of the conversation without limiting it, and this is where the craft of interviewing really emerges. The more you do it, the better you'll get at it, in all honesty. So you have that schedule of questions that you want to weave into the interview with an acceptable amount of tangents and anecdotes to follow. So my low fidelity diagram is basically this. Generally, you'll start with some open questions. You move to some further details and end hopefully with some specific details at the end of the interview with an acceptable amount of tangents. However, when you're doing interviews, you won't just do one. It'd be very unusual to have a study with a single interview. You'll be doing multiple interviews, and that gives you some more things to think about, which I'll explain on the next slide. So I've put process 1 here and process 2, which are exactly the same funnel process that I gave on the previous slide, starting from open questioning down to closed questioning and getting specific details. In process 1, let's say you've started from open questions and you've got down to your more interesting details by the end of the interview. Well, what are you going to do in your next interview then? Maybe you interview the same person at a later date, or you're interviewing other patients in the same organization. Depends what you're doing. But in essence, if you've come to some interesting conclusions in your first interview, you have now two options. Have you got that particular kernel of information that you then want to drill further down onto? So you want more and more detail, at which point then you'd start on process 1. You start from a very small, narrow or niche or well-bounded set of questions that you've formulated from your initial interview, and then you want to add some flesh to those bones, and then it'll expand back out into a more open-ended question technique. So it's sort of concertinas as you're going through different interview processes as you pick up more fixed piece of information that you want to acquire. However, if we look at process 2, you've done one interview, you've got some more specific information. However, there are many situations in life where you've come to the end of the interview, for example, or the conversation, and you have specific outcomes, and that actually provides more questions rather than less. So you've ended up with, let's say, less clarity in some circumstances. So you want to start again from an open-ended perspective. You've not got that kernel of information that you want to drill down onto. The answers from the previous interview have actually provided more thought-provoking questions for you. So you need to start another open-ended process and then hone back down in again. And this system keeps going until you've got what you want out of the process. But that is something for you to consider, that qualitative research is not a protocol-driven process. You have to see what emerges from what you've got from the initial interview phases to determine how you're going to then go forth with the rest of the body of the work. Sampling methods. So sampling methods in qualitative research. There are 3 questions really you want to ask yourself. I'll lay these out first. Who are you going to select to speak to? How are you going to sample them as those different approaches? And how much to sample. So let's start with the top. So you can talk to individuals, you can talk to teams, you can talk to organizations, or maybe like a whole site. So imagine you've not got a UK-wide study necessarily, because qualitative work typically is on a small scale, and you might want to look at the interactions between individuals and teams, or teams within an organization, or organizations within regions, for example. You have to pick which level of extraction you're going to go to and which is enough for you to learn. Excuse me. Equally, how to sample? Well, you can have a theoretical basis that you want to set up your sampling strategy from. Let's say I've read a piece of theory that talks about how organizations function, so that's a base, and I'm interested in that, so that's what I'm going to use as a basis for sampling. I will take particular types of organization, let's say, I don't know, based on a theory about how clinical organizations in primary care work, and I'll use that to select what I want, the people I'd like to approach to be part of my study. Equally, you could have something called criterion sampling, and that is really, let's say I read some other research studies that are empirical, and they've given me specific criteria about size, location, or type of organization, and I'll use those as a basis for selecting people to work with or include in my study. Something that's different from quantitative work is convenience sampling. So let's say I only want to get the opinion of a couple of patient participation groups in GP surgeries, 2 will do for the purposes of my work. Well, there's no point going to Scotland to do this if you're based in Devon or West Cornwall. You should just take the ones that are closest to you. Because you're not looking to generalize research in this particular scenario, you can just do what is convenient to you or close. There is lastly something called opportunistic sampling, of which there are many subcategories. People would have already encountered this in your daily life. If anyone has approached you on the street with a clipboard to ask you to sign up for their particular charity and part with your money, this is a type of opportunistic sampling on the person that's delivering, trying to raise funds from that charity. You're going and finding the people that are literally coming towards you in the vicinity in that particular moment. This is a perfectly acceptable type of sampling methodology depending on what you want to do with your research. Maybe you just want a particular poll or something like that. It doesn't really matter, but you can be more opportune about how you select people to be part of your case study and as generally is the case, you're not trying to generalize because the way that you're doing your qualitative work is not aimed towards generalizable conclusions. But that doesn't tell you how much to sample. So typically in qualitative work, we talk about sampling to exhaustion. This means that you don't generate anything new from what you're doing from the cases and the interviews that you go through. So if I have an objective, let's say, to sample approximately 20 general practitioners and I get through 15 and I'm getting exactly the same results, I'm getting the same themes emerge from the research, well, there's no point really in doing the extra 5 because if you've got enough for you, let's say I've done 15 interviews and 14 of them have generated the same themes, then, well, you've kind of hit the point where doing more doesn't really tell you anything. And that's called sampling to exhaustion. You can also sample within a case study or across cases. So let's say I run a case study approach for, let's take anything, one oncology department, one in Cornwall, one in Devon, one in Somerset. I can sample within those oncology departments themselves, or I can sample across those case studies, ones for the differences between the different counties, for example. Or the last thing you have to think about is something in qualitative research called participant validation. This means that you will come back to the people that you spoke to in your interviews or in who were part of your data collection, observational data collection. You would sit down and you'd talk to them about what you think you found. Maybe you've analysed some of the data already, and you get their direct feedback into your research findings. This is a good way to validate if what you think has actually happened and get the alternative perspectives of the people that you're researching yourself. If you remember in one of the initial slides, it said that in qualitative research, you are the researcher in your research. You are situating yourself in what you're doing, and that's part of this event to avoid you putting your own biases into the research itself from one particular view. So it's good to sit down with the people you actually interviewed and go through with them what you think that you found. So research from a qualitative perspective is really emergent and ongoing. I'm going to skip this basic scheme of how you do an interview, but I will focus on interviewing here in this slide. In essence, it's quite well captured by this research methodology writing wheel, if I can call it that. I.e., you start with an idea, you conduct a literature review. That might give you some theoretical formulations that you want to put into the research questions, or it might give you an empirically driven approach to the questions where you want to find out something that's based on previous literature, let's say, whatever it might be. So then that helps you understand the type of research design that you want to have. Do you want a case study approach? You just want to do interviews? Do you want to situate yourself in a team and observe ethnographically? You collect your data, you do your analysis, and then at this point you can start to get some answers, or maybe you want to introduce some theoretical lens. If you do want to, this is quite common, not obligatory depending on what you're trying to do with your study. Maybe you want to look at any gendered issues and what you're analysing. Then you compare this with other research, and then you draw some conclusions, and the wheel spins. And so basically the distinction really here, I'll show this in the next slide, is that we're going in a circle until we've got what we want out of the process and feel we have enough data to draw some kind of contextual information. So, for example, here you'll see if you start at the bottom when you're observing a phenomena, you start the initial access, maybe you get access to an organisation and you're sampling some of the staff. Then there's a specific team in that organisation that you want to talk to. So you do some more work and more reflection, more validation with the people that you talk to. Then maybe there's a particular person as we go up the spiral that you want to talk to, and then it's a slow building process until you get to the iterative understanding of what you want, rather than a protocol rigid process that's more associated with quantitative work. Of course, you can revamp some of the things in your clinical trials by going back to the Health Research Authority and changing your protocol, but that's more uncommon in quantitative work than it is qualitative, which is emergent, ongoing, and iterative as a process. So this is a slide that's cut from the NIHR learning platform, which is a platform where you can take different courses to learn about healthcare research. NIHR stands for National Institute for Health Research. This is the NHS's arm for research. This is the slide that's cribbed from their Good Clinical Practice study. So this is how they contextualize the process of research from their perspective. 5 stages, quite linear. You go from 1 to 5. This is a very typical quantitative approach to contextualizing research. Compare it with the previous slide, the spirals and the circles and the iterative progress. This is much more linear and stage gated as you go through it. And this is really one of the fundamental distinctions between quant and qual research. So what types of analysis might you typically encounter for qualitative work? Well, thematic analysis is definitely the most common if you're new to this area. Thematic analysis is one of the most common forms of analysis in qualitative research. It emphasizes, pinpoints, examines, and records patterns or themes within data. Themes or patterns across data sets are the most important part of the description of a phenomena and associated with specific research questions. So basically, you're looking at themes that come out of the answers to the particular questions you asked out of your research, out of your interview schedule. There's different ways to draw this up. You can literally print out all your transcripts from interviews, put them on the floor in front of you and look at the themes across them. You can go across them individually and then form a document where you cut out the bits that you think are interesting and coordinate them by questions. You can make an Excel sheet where, let's say, the y-axis is essentially the questions that you're asking, and the x-axis is the participant's answer, and you can start to read across the rows and see what themes emerge from it. It's up to you. There's different approaches. If you've only interviewed 5 people, it's going to be different than if you've interviewed 40. But more than anything, you read through the transcripts, you look at the individual questions, and you pull out the most common themes that emerge from them. You might also encounter discourse analysis. This is an approach of analyzing written, vocal, or sign language. The object of discourse analysis are variously defined in terms of coherent sequences of sentences, propositions, speech, or turns out talk, i.e. discourse analysis is more of a socio-linguistic method. You're not really looking at the themes that arise from discourse, you're looking at the discourse itself. So this is something you might drill down onto the more micro-linguistic interactions about how people speak, tone, intonation, smaller stuff to do with inflection, how you would change your speech patterns to interact with, say, the people with different nationalities, gender, races, or undergoing particular conditions. It's much more micro-linguistic than it is about the general themes. So this is used quite heavily in things like doctor-patient conversation, a one-to-one dialogue, where you want to drill down into the individual parts. It's less, you can use it for bigger things like multidisciplinary team meetings, but it's not necessarily the approach you might take. However, we'll contrast that with the next method of analysis I'll show you on the subsequent slide. So lastly, let's talk about narrative analysis. So we talked about themes themselves that's in the discourse. Then we talked about the discourse, themes themselves that emerge from the discourse itself, then narrative analysis, which is something else. Narrative analysis occurs when one or more speakers engage in sharing and recounting an experience or event. Typically, the telling of a story occupies multiple turns in the course of a conversation, and stories or narratives may share common structural features. This is used in longitudinal research. That's the key point. Narratives emerge when you collect data over time. In essence, it's storytelling. So let's say I am interested in understanding the patient journey of people with dementia. So I spent a year and a half with a collection of 5 patients, and I'd have very long interviews with them. I spend half a day with them, maybe I accompany them to some kind of memory clinic, and over that period I document the course of that person's interaction with the service and how their condition may or may not emerge. That is the narrative that I'm threading through the patient experience. It's very different from something like a case study approach where you're analyzing a particular event, or a thematic approach even. So this is more like less themes in a piece of work. You're looking at the entire journey from beginning to end. So it's more aligned to ethnographic approaches than anything else. So there's some more points I want to share with you that I've set up as dichotomies once more, and I've included some interesting slides for your reference that explain some of the common terms you might come into interaction with in qualitative work, like ethnography, phenomenology, etc., that we'll go through, more in essence for you to consider things in your research design. So one of the things you need to think about is the subject. So are you interested in focusing on a community, or are you interested in focusing on individual experience? So phenomenology, which is basically the study of phenomena, it's more complicated than that, and how it emerged is very interesting. But for the basic purposes, are you wanting to focus on the phenomena of individual experience? Typically, that will, if you do, that will influence how you collect the data and the types of studies that you want to run. Equally, if you don't have as much time, sometimes this is useful as compared to an ethnographic method. So the ethnographic method, you're not focusing on individual experience. It could be something more like the cultural or collective experience within a community. This is a different way to do it. So is your subject the community, or is your subject the individual experience? And there are different ways to pick to do this. So that depends on the type of study that you want to run. Equally, you need to consider the scope. So, what is the scope of your research? Ethnography, as previously stated, is a study of people and cultures. Or are you interested in like individual events? So, a case study approach is described as a detailed investigation of a single event, situation, or an individual in order to explore and unearth complex issues. So, if you're not really worried about culture phenomenon, but you are not worried about longitudinal phenomenon, and you want to focus on single events or incidents, case studies might be more appropriate for you. So what is the scope of your research? You need to ask yourself that question as well. Lastly, you also want to think about how many presuppositions you're going to have coming into your work and how that influences the theory of it. There's something called grounded theory, which is an approach, again, you can dig into it yourself, that basically said, we are going to approach the work without consulting any literature or having any presuppositions. This is an open book that we're going to fill in the pages from. Of course, if you started with some empirical literature or some theoretically driven approaches, that's no good for you. So it's a good approach if you're completely exploratory and you're not worried about taking a predetermined approach. So grounded theory is something you might want to look into. However, if that's not what you're interested in, you might be interested in something like ethnography as well, which can very well be informed by a theoretical approach or an empirical approach. So you're looking at particular bits of community or culture. Equally, you might want to take a case studies approach, which you can have predetermined questions that you want to answer from. But not all qualitative work or approaches comes in with a predetermined set of questions. Some just let the process emerge and then you fill in the blanks from it. As a summary, here's some different approaches that you'll commonly see that determine how you want to run your work. Are you interested in the phenomenon itself? Then perhaps phenomenology might be an appropriate process to take. Are you interested in a cultural or values-driven approach as well? So that might be something more appropriate for ethnography. Are you interested in the long-term following of a group of patients? So, for example, the narrative inquiry will be focused on the patients themselves over a long period of time. Your ethnographic study might be long-term as well, but you're interested in, let's say, the cancer rather than the patient. So the narrative is about the person. The ethnography can be about the culture and the values. So it's an individual versus group dynamic. Case studies, are you interested in an organizational perspective and what you're doing and the individual events that occur within those cases or those organizations? In the case, so that might be more useful for you. Lastly, consider the idea about grounded theory. Are you coming in with an open book to fill in the pages, or do you really have a specific question that you want to answer? So lastly, here's a couple of slides about some recommended reading about qualitative methods related to clinical work. One more slide. There is a third one which I'll show. You can pause it if you want to read the titles. There you go, that's it. I hope that was somewhat informative. It was a basic introduction to doing clinical research into a basic introduction to doing qualitative research in a clinical scenario. I hope it's useful, and yes, have a wonderful day.